It's gotten brighter out.
Say what?
It's gotten brighter out, so my lighting, you can see half of my face now.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we are live. Rejoining me today, extra special guest, Hakwan Lau. Hakwan, like there isn't anyone who doesn't know you, but just in case there is, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, last time I introduced myself as your guitar player. For real, I'm a professor at UCLA in this Department of Psychology and Brain Research Institute. So I'm mostly a cognitive neuroscience person, but I have a little bit of a philosophy background. I did my undergrad degree in Hong Kong, mostly in philosophy, and I lived in New York for I think 7 years. So I hung out with a lot of philosophers. So.
And now it looks, judging by your background, looks like you're going to be promoted to my drummer.
Yeah, I'm gonna, because you're too far away, I'm gonna do the drumming myself.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to be the one-man band.
Yeah, because everyone does multi-tracking these days anyway, right? Because you can't really do live.
There you go.
Say everything.
Perfect. Yeah. Put another drummer out of work. Why don't you? Come on, man.
We need more drummers in this world.
Need more drummers, yeah. I know, as a drummer, you know that old joke, what do you call someone who hangs out with musicians?
Yeah.
A drummer. Or the other one, how do you know there's a drummer at the door? The knock speeds up.
No, that's not a good drummer. No. It should be very constant.
Yeah. Oh man, so last time you were here, you were talking a lot about IIT. Are you still interested in IIT, or have you moved on from that?
I have mostly moved on. Well, I now recall, yes, we did talk about that. Yeah, I mostly moved on. If anything, we can talk a little bit about it. I think there's a kind of silver lining to make some sense of it. I mean, mostly, my stand, for those who didn't follow, I don't think IIT is a scientific theory. I think it, even as a philosophical theory, is not a particularly good one, and because it masquerades as an empirically supported theory, I think it's mostly doing damage. I can say it. I mean, it sounds harsh, but I also said it in print, so that's that. But I think recently but I continue to engage with some of them. It's not I don't like those people. It's just, I just don't like the idea. So I continue to engage with them, and there's one silver lining quickly is, so you can take the kind of Sam Coleman view, the panqualityism, and then take IIT as a instead of a behavioral functional way of of describing the quality space, you can have a physiological or physical substrate to describe the space. Now, I don't think it's a good way to do that either, because there are those arguments from Adam Pauls and people who said that space that looks weird, doesn't look like, the Tononi space, the T space doesn't look so plausible compared to the existing views. That's what Adam wrote about. But I think at least that would be the right way to do it. And if you do it that way, then as an IIT person, you only need to be a panqualityism person. You only need to buy into panqualityism, but not panpsychism, which I think is a lot better.
Do you really? That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's, well, less worse, maybe not. It's less crazy. It's less damaging.
But so what, by panqualityism, you mean like the Coleman view that the qualities, red, green, etc., are ubiquitous in nature, so that they, they're even, well, I'm not sure how he puts it, but would it be the idea that electrons have like a quality, but they're just not conscious, or?
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, if you take that view straight ahead, that would be something like that. But if you, with the IIT part being the quality basis, then it's not like everything has that. Yeah, or nearly everything.
Everywhere there's integrated information.
You have to have some complexity, and you have some quality.
Yeah, sorry, I just got to open the window. It's getting a little bit warm in here.
As we talk about this kind of stuff, I can see people get very heated. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I mean it's bad either way. I mean, to say that any of these things are everywhere is bizarre. But if you say that real conscious experiences are everywhere, I think is even more bizarre than saying some qualities everywhere. It just, it's just become basically just try to the less weight you put on that notion of whatever that is everywhere. I think better.
I mean, I was at a conference once with, actually in Taiwan, you were there, with Sam. And I was telling him that I thought the pan-qualityism was like a really bizarre view. And he was like, well, do you think the same thing about naive realism? And I was like, yeah, I think that's pretty much an equally bizarre view. That to say that red is out there is
I
a very strange view, I think.
I find it slightly less strange, but it's strange. But I think the worst of them all is really panpsychism.
Yeah, why do you think that?
Well, subjective experience. It's just like a more loaded notion. So it's to say that some physical redness is there, to me is not that crazy. To say redness is there is not so crazy. To say some even quality, is there is not so crazy. But the more you say is out there is more crazy. That's my default position. And I don't think it's a philosophical view either. I just mean crazy as in you're going to lead to you're asking for a very big scientific revolution, basically. And I don't think you guys have the ammunition to ever do that. So the bigger the revolution you demand, the crazier it is.
You mean you guys by philosophers?
Or we together, whoever, all the consciousness folks, including the scientists, actually. So if all of us join forces, and now we sign some declaration and say, well, we decided that consciousness is everywhere, and I think the rest of the scientific community is just going to cut us off. I don't think they would even snicker. They would just buy. Like that's the end of communication. So the more you demand, the crazier it is, and the more the more different from common sense it is. I think the crazier it is.
So I wonder about this because I wonder what your views generally are about theories of consciousness. Do you? So for instance, like people like Philip Goff, who's a panpsychist, obviously of some sort. He's gonna. I mean, not that I'm a friend of panpsychism, but I'm not really an enemy to it. I don't endorse it, but I think it's a view anyway. But someone like that's going to say, well, look, this is a philosophical theory of consciousness. So there's no revolution in science that needs to be made. Science does what it does. By what it does is find correlations between certain kinds of physical activity and conscious experiences. Okay. But you need a philosophical theory to say what those things are. So, and even physicalism is a philosophical theory in that sense. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's wrong?
Not at all. Yeah, I talked to Philip sometimes. I think, unfortunately, I don't think I have the authority to convince him or something about this. I really don't think that's how science and philosophy works in general. So scientists make theories all the time. It's not just measuring correlations. I think that's false. And the other part is the science of consciousness is very different. So even science, people talk about it, the different stages of a science. You talked about physics before Newton is very different from physics after Newton, and then after Einstein is a different world, and after the Second World War is a different kind of thing. Right. All these like socio-historical stages you have, and consciousness is really in a very bizarre stage where some of our funding and promotion decisions are actually made by philosophers.
Yeah.
So you guys are not doing the usual, you can enjoy your armchair theorizing in some other domain. You can think about paradoxes. Really, nobody would care. That's fine. You can say all sorts of stuff. Even in philosophy of physics, I don't think physicists are going to get upset because they feel like, yeah, you can say whatever. Like, who cares? They would do the job. Like, very few of them actually would worry about your jinxing the business. In consciousness, I think that some philosophy work is already actively doing damage to the science, and that's very different. You don't have that in other fields of philosophy.
So, but that's a sociological point, though, right? So, I think what you're saying is that the more like woo and sort of out there ideas that there are, the more people are that are in charge of funding start to think to themselves, well, we're not going to give money to that. There's only so much money, so we're not going to fund that kind of research. If that's, but I mean, IIT has these kinds of panpsychist implications, and they still get funding. So
yeah, I think they do get funding, but I'm not sure they get any mainstream biomedical funding, and that has long-term consequence to the whole structure of the science. In fact, the private funding they're getting, some of it I'm dubious. I'm dubious whether they would do good or bad in the long term. So yeah, I mean, it is sociology, which is why I think I fail to convince people like Philip of the importance of it. I think if you read, Thomas Kuhn, you should appreciate the sociology really matters.
Right.
And as a person on the ground, on the bench doing science, the sociology is kind of what there is. If you want to talk about the relationship between science and philosophy, let's talk about sociology first before you even talk about those navelist things about measurements and epistemology and ontology. No, none of that. Talk about how it actually affects my work. It affects my work in a very bad way right now. Yeah.
But so if you move past that, like if you sort of, because I agree with you basically about that point about, I mean, we wrote an open letter about this and I was a signer on that. But anyway, so I agree with the point that you're making. But if you sort of abstract away from that point, you do agree though that well, how do you put this? That theories of consciousness are philosophical ultimately in their nature. I mean, there's no empirical finding that's going to verify physicalism versus panpsychism, right? This has to be decided on philosophical grounds.
Yeah, yes and no. I think in a sense, yes. So I don't think those people are silly to think the way they do. But there's also a sense, no. There's a sense that if you assume from the outset some sort of pragmatic views about science, either you are like a Van Basten, a realist about science, or somehow, or
yeah,
like Philip Kitcher, follows some kind of ideas in philosophy of science, such that there's really sometimes there's really no truth of the matter. A lot of it is just how you can make practical progress and stuff. In that sense, then the distinction between all these empirical measurements and philosophical ideas breaks down. That distinction really breaks down. Because some ideas, so for instance, like you say, some philosophical views are ultimately philosophical. There's no empirical things to settle it. Then under that assumption, well, then those are not theories, so forget about them. So basically assume a kind of Jamesian pragmatic view. Well, then you can only talk about things that would make a practical difference.
Yeah.
Empirical difference. Yeah.
So you think that functionalism versus biologically inspired views is something that can be empirically settled?
I think so. Yeah, I think yeah, it would be very hard. That we always know we're in this for a very challenging game, but I think that's somewhat more settleable than is it a word? Somewhat more able to be settled than these like panpsychic or panquality, the kind of view.
So how would you do it though?
Well, so first you write out the theory, which I've been doing. Yeah, I think there hasn't been. Yeah, I think I think especially since the passing of Putnam and Folder, etc., there's more room for some sort of reformulation of what is a functionalist view, and a lot of the prominent philosophers that I know and read, they're on the other side. Like I think the word biopsychism has become more prominent again. Ned is a biopsychist of some sort, so Ned Block. So I think the balance has been redressed a bit. So if you just formulate the functionalist view, I just bought myself a bit of time thinking about it. So yes, how do you do that? So you write out a theory and you test the best functionalist ideas. And the idea basically comes down to it's just like something you can write out in software. You can implement it on any tissue. Then the physicalist basis does not matter. And on Ned's view, that the physical vehicle would matter. Yeah, it's all comes down to the specifics. I think it's all who makes it more plausible. At least those things seem testable under some circumstances.
But so this gets into what Ned has written about under what he calls the harder problem of consciousness.
Yeah.
Which is, so he considers Commander Data from Star Trek, The Next Generation, which I don't know if you've watched that show or not, or have any familiarity with it, but he's an android who has a brain which is not biological and functions in a very different way than ours. And Ned stipulates that it's just assumed that psychologically he's very different than us. So that maybe the kind of functional duplicate he is superficial. That at the deeper level, there's differences. So the question is whether we can know that he's conscious or not. So what you're saying is that if you design the program and you implement it and it works, then you would know that the thing is conscious. But what evidence would count that it's conscious?
For the commander or for the software that I write?
For either.
I think there will be a matter of induction. So if you first find it in humans, this is exactly the kind of algorithm. Whenever you observe it, the person said it's conscious. Maybe the person is even yourself. And when you implement the same program and replace the neurons by silicon chips and stuff, then the person said, no, I lack the qualia now. Then you find out from the person, and then you generalize from there. Then in that case, the commander data would be unconscious, and then the software that I write will be conscious just by that fact. So it's just basically a matter of induction.
Seems like winning by stipulation.
No. I don't think I'll win by stipulation. I think I'll win by sociology. I think I'll win because I would say, well, look, this is how it works in humans, and this is the kind of consciousness we know about. And if you have a commander data that has a different algorithm, yeah, who knows? Maybe it's conscious, but it's not the kind of consciousness that we have anyway. Probably, we don't know. I think the scientific community would be more willing to accept the generalization from that side.
Yeah, I mean, the assumption that if you replaced a part of the brain with a silicon chip that did the same function, that if it really did exactly the same job, then the person would be unable to say, I lack the quality.
That's right.
Since it would give rise to the same judgments, and so they might lack the quality and still say that they have it.
No, so that's right. So this is actually interesting. I think that gets to the things that may be more worth talking about. I think if you actually replace the physical substrate, if you replace the entire physical substrate and the entire functional correlates, the whole thing, then of course, yeah, functionally should give the same output. So you should not expect to have any difference. The person would say the same thing. I have the same quality. But if you just replace, let's say, just within a modality, so within the visual cortex, you replace those neurons with silicon chips, then the linguistic faculty and everything is kept constant.
Right.
Then I think for the same introspection and same linguistic faculty, they should be able to tell you, okay, I can somehow do the same visual task, but if it feels different, they should be able to tell you that.
But
at least that's the assumption. And maybe
if the visual cortex is doing the same job, then it's sending the same outputs to the same areas.
Yeah.
So that should amount to you making the same linguistic reports, right? I mean, where's the room for difference?
Yeah, I think the room for difference. Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think the room for difference is doing the same job and what job. So if you replace the neurons with some other silicon circuits that captures by definition all the functions, then yes, then it would by definition be the same. Yeah. But if you capture the functional description that is in the current recipe, so it's like, say, I currently think that neurons produce firing, and the firing rate follow this distribution. So the current functional recipe is such and such. I write on a piece of paper, and then I use my silicon chips to replace that, and I follow that functional recipe. And by the time if I do that, then if there's no difference whatsoever, then I think people would think, oh, then this functional recipe is very good. Whereas if you replace the functional recipe, you take the functional recipe and replace it with some chips, and then you end up having blindside. The person you have super blindside. The person can do all the visual tasks, but if you ask them to reflect, they would say, well, yeah, something feels a bit funny. Red doesn't look the same way. It kind of looks, nothing looks colorful anymore. But if I ask me to do the task, I can do it. If something like that happens, then you know that your functional recipe isn't so good. Right. And to the extent that your functional recipe is so good that it really works functionally so well in all aspects, I think I know that there's a philosophical lingering question. How do you know there's not a zombie there? But I think what will happen is science would just not care. Yeah, I see what you mean. But it would take a long time, and it's not a trivial thing at all. Very likely, if you study it as well as you can, write out the functional recipe, that functional recipe would probably do some basic, type 1 first order functions, and may lack some type 2 that is higher order introspective aspect. Right. So I think that is very real. And in that case, I think people like Ned would say, you see, then clearly your functionalism is not strong enough.
Yeah,
so there's
like,
a debate you can have.
Yeah, it's similar to like a point that Dave Chalmers has made. He says, if your grandma goes and gets an artificial auditory cortex and comes home and says, "Oh, it's great to hear your voice," you're not going to say, "Screw you, grandma, you can't really hear." Like, it's just a functional duplicate. You don't really hear my voice. Eventually, if enough, you'll sort of sociologically, we'll just come to accept it because
I may even do more. I may even put grandma through a whole bunch of psychophysical tests that we know, can track blind sight behavior, and you can do all sort of stuff that you can get grandma to your phenomenologist or whoever friends who read a lot of phenomenology and just try to really write essays and describe and dream journals, and you can do all the stuff. I mean, but if you really functionally mean everything is identical, I think for all practical purposes, the scientific community would not care about those hypothetical absent qualia cases.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I guess I would still kind of care, but I would start to care a little bit less. Yeah, because I'm on the other side. My hope is that we won't get the functional recipe. That would just solve the case really, really quickly. If we said there's no way to functionally duplicate what is going on without the substrate, then that would pretty much decide the issue.
I think that's another scenario too. Yeah, which I think is quite likely. I think right now, if we can get some functional recipe, but probably it would do very little.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's interesting about your defense of functionalism that you've been working on lately is that you have like a internalist version of it, I guess I'd say. It's just a computer program. It doesn't need to be embodied, doesn't have to interact with the world, apparently. It doesn't have to be connected to like a robotic. So you're against the kind of embodied and active trend in cognitive science or philosophy of cognitive science?
I'm not against it. I'm not against it at all. I think there's a lot going on for that, but I think ultimately, what is constitutive, I think is not going to be. I think those embodied factors are causal and has a probably shaped how things are, but I think ultimately, if you really have a brain in the void, I think it should be conscious. I think the intuitions and the empirical evidence seems to go stronger with that. So when you're dreaming, you're not embodied. You still have a body, but your body is not in the dream.
Right.
I'm putting it clumsily, but you know what I mean. So your body is not directly interacting with the dream objects, but you dream pretty fine. It may not be exactly like the real thing, but it's pretty damn close.
Right. But some people would say that's because you've had the embodied experience. I mean, that's where you get.
So I think the causal history may matter. I ultimately think the causal history only mattered to the extent that it changed the physical substrate. So if you actually have a brain in the void or a program in the void, you would just be the same. And that's just a view. But of course, both views are difficult. The externalist view has other issues, as you know.
Yeah.
So I think people try externalism, it doesn't work. So I think this should be an internalist functionalist view.
There are some people who respond like to the Chinese room argument, the Searle business with the idea that Turing test isn't good enough. You got somebody in the room manipulating these characters, giving the output. So some people have the intuition that the room doesn't understand the language, doesn't understand what it's saying, doesn't understand the questions that are being asked. Other people have the intuition that the room does understand, that maybe no part of the room understands it, but the room as a system understands it. And then there's the other reply that says, well, the room needs to be able to interact with the world. It needs to have a body. It needs to be able to walk around. It's got to interact with things in order to give content to its thoughts. So if it says something in this language that, I like dogs, it doesn't know what a dog is. It's never interacted with a dog. It doesn't have any connection to the actual category of things. So is what you're saying here that the causal history is important for that sort of reason, giving content?
No, yeah, I think the causal history is only, as I said, the causal history only mattered to the extent it actually changed the substance in the program or the head. So it's really a distal cause. But
But what do you mean changes the substance?
So when you actually causal, you have an interaction. To put it this way, I think this is a way that I stole from. I am stealing from Adam paused, that would be useful. So he has an example, I think in the book that where we both have a chapter. In that block's a Festrick book, and I think Adam has its hypothetical case of a brain in a void. So you would take your brain and then do a molecule by molecule duplicate of it, and then just put it in a completely empty environment. Then you should have the intuition is that brain should have conscious experience. You may not buy that, but that I think that basically cuts off the entire environmental history and embodiment. Right? And I think
so. Just to be clear, do you mean like your brain showing up in a void, or just a fresh brain, like a Boltzmann brain? It never existed before.
Yeah. So you duplicate the brain, right? So you don't take my brain. My brain's still here. You just create another brain. So that brain will be a new brain, but it's designed to mimic exactly your brain right now.
Right.
And then it created in the void, and presumably that brain would feel something.
Right.
Yeah. And so either you buy that or you don't buy. Some people, maybe like Michael Tai, would say no, because lack of history, there's no causal tracking history. It depends on this kind of semantics that you subscribe to. Some people might say it lacks content. But I think for people like me who's an internalist, what we mean is that thing would have exactly the same conscious experience as I have for a bit, right? And until then the external inputs doesn't match up and etc. Then the brain probably dies. Yeah. But for the first moment.
But you said the same thing. So it's one thing to say that about like conscious experience. It's seeing, suppose it's looking at a red dog, a dog that's red. Which dogs are red? I don't know, a poodle or something like that. That has pink fur. So there's one claim that it would have the same, qualitative character in its phenomenal consciousness, that it sees red. There's another claim that it would have the thought, there's a dog, and its thought would be contentful. Do you think both are true, that it's having a contentful thought, there's a dog, and also the experience, or are you just talking about the experience?
I'm just talking about the experience. About the thought, I think that's a trickier issue. I think it would, for all practical purpose, yes, you will have the same thought. But I don't want to get too deep into the linguistic issues about true conditional and all that stuff. But I think for practical purpose, it would behave the same way.
Right. It would behave the same way.
If they behave the same way, then it's the same. Like I'm a very much a pragmatist when it comes to an empiricist when it comes to content and all this stuff. I don't think there's anything magical. I think we say that there's content when it's useful to postulate content in accounting for the function. Yeah, I don't think there's anything more than that. So to the extent that the same thing behaves the same way, you would say that there's the same content. So this is actually, the brain and void comes from an argument, a little exchange I have with Adam. So Adam thinks that brain and void would not be reducible because you have internal content and you run through any programs of reduction like Hartree field. It would be very hard for it to go through because it doesn't have the actual physical external relations. So the reduction program would not go through. I actually think it should be reducible for any meaningful notion of reductionism, because my computer in void, if I do the same thing on computer, take my MacBook Air and then do a molecule by molecule duplicate, then it would function the same way.
Right.
And now that for the same Hartree field type of reduction program, you should also not be able to reduce any content there. But I find it just crazy because that computer would work exactly the same way. And if you say that computer has no content, I think your theory of content is wrong. So I would think that, basically you would have the same content. It would be reducible, it would be naturalistic and all that.
Yeah, but Adam's talking about the experiential content not being reducible.
Yeah, so I think that to the extent that if your normal content is reducible, then the experiential content should also be reducible. If the experiential content is reducible to content in the first place.
Yeah, so I mean, I was gonna. That's interesting that you're saying this, because I was thinking it is weird that you appeal to Adam's work so much when he's like a known irreducible guy.
I
non-physicalist.
Just stop at the reduction part, and he's aware that he's not perfectly happy with the irreducible part either. He just didn't see a way out, I think.
Yeah. So what is it? So your point is that it's reducible to some functional aspect of the brain in the void.
I would say somehow reducible. I think reduction is just very hard for me. and I think it's very hard for a lot of people, right? We used to think, so the notion of reduction has changed over the course of the last few decades. And my baseline, my bottom line is just, if you can do it on a computer, if you can engineer the thing, it's got to be reducible. I don't care what notion of reduction you have, how Hatfield and other people has spelled out the program of reduction. I just don't care. I think if your program of reduction cannot reduce the functions and content of my MacBook Air, then your theory is no good.
Yeah. But why? I mean, I don't understand that line of argument, because there are people, I mean, I think Chalmers may be one of them, who are going to say, if you have a program which is like simulating your brain, that program's going to have conscious experience, because there are laws which relate the functional profile to these irreducible non-physical qualities.
Yeah.
So you can do it on a computer, but it doesn't give you a reducible conscious experience on their view.
Well, on their view, it doesn't. On my view, it does. Yeah.
But what's the argument for that, though?
Well, my view is just that basically my view is that most function. Yeah, this is interesting to lay out the argument. I haven't done it. So most programs of reduction, if you follow Adam, would say that a bring-in void would not be reducible. The content of the bring-in void would not be reducible. And I'm saying, if you take just a MacBook Air, just a simple, or even not a MacBook, just a PC, just a lowly PC laptop, and do the same molecule by molecule duplicate in void, and the same current programs of reduction mostly would say that the content there would not be reducible either. And to me, that seems to suggest that the current programs of reductions are too strong. And so I'm not saying that I have a positive argument why it would be reducible. I'm just saying, stipulating that just a simple PC, your arguments already cannot reduce it, then I just don't care what you say about conscious experience being not reducible anymore, because clearly your program of reduction is just too narrow.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by saying that the PC wouldn't be reducible. So is the idea supposed to be that its internal states wouldn't compute the same functions, or that it wouldn't process information in the same way? Because I think many people would say that I mean, as far as I understand, like the Chalmers view, it's true that the PC would compute all the same functions.
Yeah, I think it's the internal content that is not reducible. So I think this Adams in the book chapter laid out is that if you have internal content that is internally individuated, so that you can have the computer in void, which I think it is. You can do that. And then if the content is externally directed, so let's say you talk more about what content in the PC, in the laptop. The laptop actually has some images of cats. Okay, some of you have the holiday pictures, and some of them have cats, and some of them have dogs, and some of them have people. And then you write a little program, which is not that difficult to write, to just like a background antivirus software that it just scans through all the files constantly. And whenever it detects a cat image, it would just like make a copy and put it in the folder.
Okay.
Labeled cat. Okay, so like cat. So it's like a cat collecting little background software. Okay, which is all doable on a cheap PC. And sure. Now you try to make this thing a computer in void. So you duplicate the computer and then put it in a new environment in which there are no cats, no nothing, right? And now the question is, how do you reduce those content? Can you still say that this laptop has naturalistic, reducible content about cats? I would say yes.
Yeah, I don't think that Adam would deny that. I mean, there's no phenomenal content there.
That actually, because Adam, I think at least as far as I understand, the argument is for the brain. I mean, at least I don't see this analogy yet. So the analogy, the problem was for the brain in void, it was because the content was internally individuated, and I think in this case it's gonna be. So even if this computer goes to a world where cats are all upside down, have 6 legs. They're mostly pink and silver. That it wouldn't matter, because for that computer, the internal program that detects cats and copy them has its own internal semantics, right? It looks for cats as it was designed to do in the first place. So if we continue to look for that kind of cat, the external environment wouldn't matter. So it's internal content. It's externally directed because those cats were images of something outside. So it's not about the computer itself. It's not about the vehicle properties. It's about things outside. And I think then Adam would say it's not reducible. I never understood why. And I think the argument all comes from that Hartree-Field program of reduction, in which you have to spell out the relations of things. And then you go through step by step. It's super geeky, it's beyond my pay grade, but apparently Adam thinks this is the right, at least there's no better approach to do that. He made an argument there. And if you do that, then he said, well, because then you cannot reduce the bring in void content because you now lack the environmental history. With the external world, you can't lay out those relations anymore. So you can't lay out the relations, you can't reduce the relations. If you can't reduce the relations, you can't reduce the content because the content is always relational.
Right.
The content about a cat is about your relation to the cat. And I think to the extent that's true, that's also true for my computer. My computer in void. Because now the computer in void lacks the environmental history. It's not in an environment that has cats at all. So it also would fail.
Yeah, but I thought a big part of the argument there was that the externally directed part is necessarily a component of the phenomenal content. So if you see the round square, it's a necessary component that it's external, has that externality to it or something, that presentational character or whatever. But that's not the case for these images of cats or in whatever format they're stored, which is going to be bits. It's not necessary that those things have that.
I see. Yeah, there's a subtlety that I missed. So that's helpful. I mean, if that is this analogy, I would accept that. Then my argument would fail. But I'm not sure I get the difference between the phenomenal content is necessarily externally directed. I think the GIF images, the JPEG files, are also pretty damn externally directed. It is taken from the external world, at least once upon a time. Or at least in the non-void version, and it's about cats out there. It's not about cats inside the computer. So I'm not sure I would agree with this analogy, but to the extent there's this analogy, that's good. I mean, that actually has gone further than I have with my exchange with Adam. I still couldn't figure out this analogy before you pointed out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll have to think about it more because I think you're raising an interesting point. So I wonder if we could table that topic for a second, because I want to ask you about the perceptual reality monitoring, the current version of it. So can you give us an update? I know it's gone through some changes in the last, brief history of time. Where are you at currently on this model?
Yeah, so the idea is kind of like a variant of a higher order view. I think that's helpful. When I try to talk to scientists, I try to just present it afresh. But I think when it comes to with you folks, it's always better to anchor it to where it comes from. It's really kind of like a variation of a higher order view, in particular, kind of Rosenthal type or Sellers, in kind of that lineage. So I think the idea is that there's a higher order machinery that I don't think is a thought per se. It's more like a perceptual process. And in fact, the perceptual process is just, it looks at kind of like exactly how neural networks would do. It looks at the first order representation and then try to decide whether it is self-generated or externally triggered. That's a prime. And that has a kind of developmental evolutionary argument why you want to do that, because if you want to be able to do top-down imagery, one good way is to have this kind of adversarial competitor in your brain that would tell you when it's internally generated, externally generated, to kind of punish the top-down generator for generating things that are too bad.
So the GANs.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. So it comes from a computational argument. So we have that, then you have that, then that thing basically is the same thing as a perceptual network. So it's really a higher order perceptual view. And so that's first. And the second part is that it doesn't really duplicate the content. As in perceptual networks, you don't necessarily duplicate whole content. You pass it up the network so that you just lead to a categorical decision in the end to say real, not real, basically like that.
So don't, in the kinds of adversarial networks that you get from computer science, don't you get duplication of the contents? Aren't they trying to generate things which are indistinguishable from the inputs?
That's right. Yeah. So the generator has some content. I'm talking about, but this is a discriminator. So
this is the discriminator, right? Okay, yeah, right.
But the architectures are not fully worked out, and there are different variants. So the discriminator also knows a lot of stuff. So when I say that it doesn't have the content, I always say it doesn't necessarily have the content. I'm not totally sure about what it has, but at least it doesn't have the content in very explicit forms. So it doesn't just duplicate the same image. It might have the same information at the end of the day. I don't really know. We are working on it right now, actually, as we speak. So Taylor Webb, my postdoc, like actually modeling this stuff.
Oh, really? Cool. Okay, I'll be interested to see that. So I wonder just if I could ask a general question that kind of hedge into maybe putting some pressure on your way of thinking about stuff.
Yeah.
So do you think that there are ever cases where we kind of have misrepresenting going on in terms of our conscious experience? So so if I look in the closet, I see a jacket. I think the jacket's red, but I don't think what specific shade of red it is. You think that sort of stuff happens?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. And do you think you can experience the redness in a kind of generic way like that?
I think so. Yeah, I think so.
All right. So then that's one of the motivations for the kind of traditional higher order view, is that, well, you can have these kind of conceptual states that describe your first order states in a kind of generic way, but we assume that the first order states are pretty maximally differentiated, so that whatever shade of red it is, there's a mental quality corresponding to that, and then you're kind of aware of it in a generic way. It's just red. So how on your way of carving up this stuff are you going to say something similar to that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same in the end. I would say, I think in some way my view has more flexibility. There's a paper Andrew Lee, I think, will be presenting, or has already published, that has kind of touched on these points. So if you have a mental quality space, I think Rosenthal would say on the higher order, and probably you too, on the higher order stage, you would just conceptualize it. So you just take a large swath of a space on the mental quality space, and say, okay, so all these like little different shades of red, like just red, or some conceptualizing. You can even conceptualize in some more fine-grained way. I think you never do, because the content stays in the first order, right? So I think you're asking very correctly, like, then how do you misrepresent? I think you misrepresent because you the higher order part does have some content. The higher order part basically refer to some vehicle properties. So that's because in the brain, red neurons are some spatially distributed groups of neuron, and scarlet neurons are scarlet neurons are some spatially distributed groups of neuron, and crimson is another. Is it crimson or crimson? Crimson is another. I have metacognition before you. I know I'm wrong. So crimson is another spatially distributed group of neurons. And so the higher order state basically try to refer to those addresses, which is basically the physical locations, which is actually not so implausible, because you send feedback connections, then you pick feedback connections, projections, target some neurons. And when you do that, you could misrepresent there. So you can send a top-down signal that is so mushy that it would be exactly between crimson and scarlet. Then you would basically, so you have something like crimson, scarlety, red. Then how do you get generic red though? Then you just send a signal so mushy that it would target all the reddish neurons.
What do you mean by mushy here? Like the address is like, I'm sending the letter to New York.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you lack specificity. Yeah. So in the same way,
yeah. Okay. It's interesting that's an interesting way of cashing it out. But so I wonder what you say about the kind of what I think is the kind of flagship argument that like David Rosenthal has against this way of thinking, which is that it's just a notational variant of his way of thinking.
Yeah.
And in particular, that it's an implementation of it, so that, you know, on his view, when you have these states, you have some state that says, I am seeing red. So that there's a conceptual content that you're seeing red. So as far as I understand this line of thinking, his point of view is that if you have an index that indexes an area where red lives, then in a way you're conceptually representing red. So that it just may be a kind of implementation of a way of implementing the thought, I am seeing red.
Yeah. So for a long time, I agree to that flagship argument, and I think that's fine. It's also a good way to not let insider disagreements like blow up and expose our weakness too much to our real opponents, like the first order guys. But with that caveat, yeah, I think that still is mostly fine. But it may be more helpful to spell out how is actually different at all. So I think, yeah, in the end, maybe for the important things, it doesn't really matter. I think I'm not arguing that my view is better in that sense. So there's no argument to be had in some sense.
Right.
But just to spell out what I think is potentially some difference. The difference is if you only let the higher order conceptualized level determine your content of your perception, of your conscious content, then I think it's harder for you to go to the other side and say when you have really fine-grained experience. Yeah. Then either your conceptualization will become very, very good, which may be one way. I find it implausible. I think concepts ultimately has only so much fineness of brain. I think if you really, the advantage of my view, or maybe not advantage, at least the way that it goes is you always go back to the first order vehicle. And there is maybe half an insight there that I think often is missed by some folks doing this mental quality space, is that the mental quality space is basically a space on which, you know, functionally similar stimuli are placed in a closed location, right? By functionally similar, I mean they're behaviorally, functionally not so discriminable. Yeah.
Right.
So the distance reflect the lack of, or the inverse of, behavioral discriminability. But you think so the space seems very magical to me. Like, how do you create that, right? You have to do pairwise psychophysics and measure all the JNDs. And David would say, well, that's fine because you don't need the space in your head. I mean, I'm just telling you how the space were to be constructed. If you have to construct it, you don't need to construct it. And I always feel that's not very helpful because I think we do have some grasp of that space.
From the first person, you mean?
Yeah, I think we do, and I'll give them an argument later. But let's assume that for a moment. Then how do you get that space? So I've been thinking, how do you get that space? Then it's actually very easy because all the behavioral discriminability, where does it come from? It actually comes from the vehicle similarity, right? So if two first order vehicles are similar, then of course the whatever stimuli they are representing would be not very discriminable. So scarlet and crimson are similar because some of those neurons overlap in your V4, and scarlet and blue look very different because very different neurons are involved. So if you know your own vehicle properties, if you know the properties of your first order vehicles, then you kind of have that space for free. So that's why
this is like your dictionary analogy, basically, right?
Yeah. So that's why I like to do this in the first order space, because then you basically then, without having to like meta represent the whole space in some sort of concrete, highly implausible way, all you need to do is for your higher order system to know the first order vehicles very well and know, okay, if you give me this vehicle, like this is the neural pattern for scarlet, I know that they are just like 5 neurons different from crimson, and there will be 12 neurons different from pink, and there will be 13 neurons different from purple, etc., etc. Yeah. So you just need to know.
So, but don't you just get all the same complexity issues, but now in terms of locations instead of concepts? I mean, it seems like you don't really, because the higher order system still has to know the space. And I mean, that information has to be encoded in the higher order system itself, right?
Yeah. Well, it doesn't have to be encoded. It has to be implicitly encoded. Yes, that's right. Yeah. But I think that's much more plausible that to say that your PFC knows the statistical properties of your visual area neurons. I think they do. They're very well connected, and the connections basically already, encapsulate the relationships. Right?
Yeah. So, I mean, how knowing the statistical properties is one thing. How does it know that it's red versus crimson versus green?
I see. It doesn't know that it's red versus crimson versus green. It just knows. Well, they don't know that in such a way, but they know that red is closer. Crimson is closer to scarlet than to green.
But it doesn't know that crimson is the thing which is closer to scarlet than the green. It knows there's some pattern of neurons that are closer to this pattern than the other pattern of neurons.
That's right.
So where's the redness, the greenness?
So there's no atomist redness. Yeah, there's only a structuralist. There's no red. There's only redder.
Yeah. Well, I think that much quality space people can agree. I mean, personally, I'm neutral about quality space versus like a first order representation. So I don't really care. But I like quality spaces. I study with Austin and obviously with David.
Yeah. I'm only recently discovered it. I mean, Theory of Sentience.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great book. He wishes he had changed the name to sensory reference or something like that. But anyway, it's a great book. Him and David only have small disagreements about, like, for instance,
I wish he changed his book so that it has the word consciousness in it, so more people would read it.
Yeah, I know.
So many people actually. I mean, I come from Frege Slick. You see how crazy it is. I should have read that first before I go into all this Frege Slick.
Exactly.
But
I agree. But anyway, so we're going to get to the Frege Slick. Don't worry, that's coming. But my question here was that, I mean, there's a couple questions. So one, well, let me back up for a second, because so the idea is supposed to be that there's this quality space at the first order level, and it's all relationally defined, so that there's no redness, as you said. There's only redder. This thing is more red than that thing, which is less red than the other thing, and so all this massive sets of relations. That's interesting and wonderful. And then there's the higher order system, which learns over time, or in some sense comes to discriminate between these profiles at the first order level. And that sounds very good. I like that. But the question was, so how is it that you get to consciously experience red? Your answer is, well, there's a state, which is the higher order thing is determining, is veridically representing something in the external world or something like that. But where's the quality? The quality is simply the firing of the conscious experience of it. I mean, where does that content come from?
Yeah, I'm not sure it comes from a place, but I can tell you, in that sense, it would be the same as, very similar to Rosenthal's, right? So you first have the first order quality, and then that first order quality gets somehow not meta represented, but it gets into some sort of higher order awareness that you, because of the perceptual reality monitor, decides or perceives that perceived may be better. Like perceives that first order quality to be legitimately reflecting the world, then you have a conscious experience with that quality.
Right.
But I sound like
so I know we're going to talk about invert cases in a second, but I mean, maybe this would come up here, because why couldn't it have been an experience of green as opposed to red? What's preventing that?
Oh, I see. Let me put it this way. If that creature, if whatever individual has only one experience in one's entire life, then I would say there's no fact of the matter. I think that single experience would be neither red nor green. It would be light, or even maybe less, or just experience. So the experience comes in because when you become aware of the first order mental quality, and that first order mental quality now take on this Fregean content. So it first of all, it has a Russellian content. It refers to some reflectant properties or whatever complex stuff in the world, and it tracks that. But when it get represented in the higher order awareness, it was in a different mode of presentation that is all relative to the other stuff, right? So you see it as red because you see, well, this is different from green, and just being different from green doesn't tell you it's red, but it's different from green and it's quite close to purple and somewhat like orange and somewhat like pink. and not at all like blue and not like yellow, then this is red. You know that it is like those other things, and that tells you that it is pink.
Yeah, but the sense in which the discriminator knows these similarities are just in terms of neurons firing. I mean, the whole system is set up in just statistical differences in the behavioral profile of the first order neuronal firing activity.
Yeah.
So where's the redness? I mean, on the other version, the redness comes from the intentional content. You actually have the concept red in there. You say, I am seeing red. So the seeing of red is, that's how you represent yourself. I just don't see how something like that comes out of the view that you have. It seems like just like a brute fact.
I see what you mean. Yeah. Now you're getting to, this is actually something I want to talk to you about. It's actually challenging. So I think, first of all, let's say, I'm not sure on your view, I don't think on your view is solve this problem so easily either. So where does the phenomenal red really comes from? I think it's a pretty hard question, right? Maybe it is the hard problem, arguably. And you say, well, just because you have the concept red, and the concept red is a concept of mental red, and when you represent that, you're seeing something with mental red, then you have the phenomenal content. I find it a little bit magical too, just as you might find my view the same. Just how does this?
Well, it's a different level of magicalness. I agree. There's a level you might still question, but at least there's something you can point to and say, well, there's an awareness of yourself as seeing red. But I don't see how you get to say the same thing.
Well, I think it's not the same thing exactly, yes, because it's not conceptualized. So the difference is just it's not conceptualized. But it has a mode of presentation that is not in terms of firing of neurons. So I think I should clarify that. The mode of presentation, so basically the mode of presentation contains the vehicle properties, similarity relations. So it ultimately is determined by the firing properties. But the mode of presentation is not like in terms of firing. So it's not that crazy. It's in terms of
Phrygian mode.
Yeah, the Phrygian content. You Phrygian or Phrygian?
I don't know. Yeah,
like freakish. The freakish.
Maybe Phrygian. I probably mispronouncing it. I don't know.
Anyway, I don't know. Yeah, so it's German, right? Frege, whatever. Phrygian.
Yeah, he's an asshole, so I don't really care. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I heard he's racist or something.
Yeah, big time. Yes.
Okay, well then maybe let's use the F word. The F content. The effing content. Yeah, the effing content is in relation of the other stimuli you have perceived, right?
Yeah.
So it's basically it's kind of some sort of relational. It doesn't say, well, it's not in terms of firing pattern. It said like, so what you're seeing now was like this, those things that you've seen recently, those things, and those things you can summon from memory, and those things you can summon from imagery.
Right.
It's in space. So in imagery, the point of imagery is to top-down create a pseudo first-order vehicle in order to get back to that space. So it's the same content, same mode of presentation for you to do things in imagery, to think about what something is like. And so to my mind, that accounts for the phenomenology. That's where redness comes from. So to see something as phenomenally red is just to be able to think about what it's like.
But so which thing? I mean, I don't want to be dense, but I just don't understand which thing has the content. So the first order state has this content, or the higher order state has the content, or the jointly both of them have the content.
Oh yeah, sorry. No, this is good. So they jointly have the content. Yeah, they join. So the first order state has that mental quality space position, just as in Rosenthal. And in Rosenthal's and yours, I think you guys conceptualize that position and put the content in the higher order state. And I don't. I have a higher order state that point to by point to, I don't mean that just figuratively. The higher order state refers to that first order vehicle, which has the first order quality space. And by referring to the vehicle, though, by referring to the vehicle in the vehicle address, it actually encapsulates also the position on the mental quality space. Yeah, so it's not explicitly encoded as such, but it's there between the two things.
So it's not something that they actually, there's no content. There's no state which has that content.
It doesn't explicitly have that content. So it's kind of like if I tell you.
So who reads it out?
Yeah, somewhere downstream, all the behavioral consequences will read it out, but implicit content can be read out. Yeah. So you need to be made explicit for it to be read out. Yeah.
I mean, so is this supposed to be all be going on at the subpersonal level? And
yeah, all of this.
How does the person get to experience redness?
Yeah, so that's interesting. It just does.
Like for like on the tradition, the way that I think about this stuff, which is very similar to the way David does, although with slight differences, but still there's a representation that explicitly has the content that I am seeing red. So you describe yourself as being in a state of seeing red. So there's a self, there's a state of seeing and the redness. It's all kind of attributed in the description, which is why it appears to you to be that way. So that's all at the personal level, so to speak. But all this machinery that you're talking about, I mean, I like it. I'm not against it. I'm just trying to understand like how the experience is generated, or how it's identical to it, or where the experiential properties are in the picture.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull a. The true answer is I don't know actually. So let me not be too pretentious. And but I'm gonna pull a pretend play Wittgensteinian reply to this.
Oh no.
I'm gonna say, there's something about the grammar of the concept of having an experience that might be getting us into all this trouble here. If you say, well, you have to instantiate an experience and some experiential properties, once you get into that kind of talks, I think you get into a lot more trouble. So there's another way I could prefer to say it. I think that would basically scratch the same itch, which is to say the person can think about what it is like to have the current experience. And I think, yeah, I'm going to try to account for that. And to the extent that I think a person can think about what it is like to have that experience, I don't care whether you actually instantiate the experience or some redness quality was instantiated or something. That is something that some philosophers who are good with predicate logic and all this can work it out. I don't talk in these like properties and objects and instantiation terms. I think humans who don't talk in those terms usually. We just say that person sees red, and there is something it's like for that person to see red. And why you say there is something it is like? Why you say there is something it's like? You say, well, because that person can think about what that thing is. That person can think about what it is like.
Yeah. So I guess I don't agree with that part of what you're saying. It doesn't seem like I need to think about redness in order to have there be something that it's like to see red.
I'm not saying that you have to, but I'm saying that the major reason, at least for me, to say, let's say there's a Martian here. And you ask the Martian, is there anything like it is like to see red? And the Martian said, no, like, I don't think so. Because when I see red, I can't think of what it's like. Or the Martian, she would probably, or it would say, there is nothing it is like. But by saying that, the Martian is telling you, according to it, it couldn't think what it is like, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that you have to think about, but I'm saying that most of the evidence for you to think there is something is like, because we can think that what it is like. When I tell you that there's,
I don't think that's right. I think that it's just because when you see red, there's something that it's like to see red. That's the evidence.
That's what you think.
You see it. Yeah.
That's what you think.
I don't know if it's what I think.
That's what you think. That's why you say
the way it is.
The reason you say there's something it's like is because you think there's something it's like. If you don't think there's something it's like, you wouldn't say there is something it's like.
Yeah, I don't think I would have to say that there's something that it's like in order for there to be a way that it appears to me.
Yeah, it could be, but if you don't say there's something dislike, I'm going to assume there's nothing to dislike.
I mean, but that's not true. You don't take that view like with respect to monkeys and.
No, I don't. But that's because they can't say anything anyway.
Yeah, that's my point.
But I'm saying if there's a Martian, let's continue the Martian. The Martian say there is something it is like to smell. Certainly, it smells like this. Cheese smells like a bit like slightly unpleasant, but also delicious and kind of thing, and tell you. And then, but what is it like to see? Nothing. Well, then you would agree. Then yeah, then the Martian probably have no visual qualia, but have smell qualia, olfactory
Right.
qualia.
Yeah.
So it really is. If that creature doesn't think that there is something it is like, but think that there's something it is like to go through some other experience, that's the basis for the demarcation between conscious and unconscious.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. There are people right now arguing in the comment section over there that they don't understand what it's like means at all. So, I mean, some people disagree
so I'm
about
not as
this whole
crazy as you are.
way of talk being meaningful. But I mean, so there's conscious experience. There's a way things appear to you when you have conscious experience.
That's right.
And what it sounds like what you're saying is you want to capture why people think that there's conscious experience. Which sounds like you're maybe quasi-illusionism, or what'd you call it, illusionism or something. So that's what the illusionist says. They say the illusionist says, I want to explain why people say they are conscious, why they think they're conscious, and then you're done basically. But that's not what you're saying, is it? Or is it?
No. So in the end, I'm not. I think I can qualify what kind of illusionist I am. I am a methodological illusionist, which is to say, I think for practical purposes, if you go the illusionist direction in thinking and in especially thinking scientifically, that would be the best way to get you to the true answer. I'm not an ontological illusionist.
You're a methodological illusionist?
Yeah, I'm creating these like new
Awesome.
terms. Yeah. So I'm a methodological illusionist. I think if you do science, that's the way you go, right? You kind of assume it's an illusion to some extent, and then try to work out why do we kind of. So basically, it comes down to you subscribe the meta problem strategy. You try to figure out why they think they're conscious first, and then from there you might figure out something. And when it comes to ontology or metaphysics, whether I'm really an illusionist, no, I'm an Edenic illusionist. Yeah, I think Edenic content is illusory. But conscious experience.
You want to say what Edenic content is before we go any further? In case.
I don't know. The way I understand it, so you have Russellian content that refers to the reference that is typically externally individuated. So I told you, like Adam and other people, I don't like externalism, so I want to be internal. One way to go effing content. F content.
It's trying to say Freudian.
Yeah, so Freudian, and then so it's an internal mode of presentation. And for me, that is basically all the relations. So when you see, it's the same red that you're referring to, but you refer it as a bit like orange, bit like pink, bit like scarlet, bit like crimson, this sort of stuff. So Edenic content is also internal, but it just refers to some imaginary object in some imaginary world, imaginary properties in some imaginary world. So it's not a mode of presentation, it's more like Russellian. It has an external directedness, it has a reference, and not as a true condition, but all the truth condition depends on that hypothetical world.
Yeah.
That is the Edenic world. So it's kind of like some idealized atomist representation of red.
Yeah, the way Chalmers puts this is that in Eden, when you look at a red apple, the apple is perfectly red. The apple itself has that qualitative property, it's redness. But we found out that our world isn't like that.
Yeah. So I'm an Eden. I think that is illusory. Yeah.
Yeah, but so does Chalmers. I mean, everyone thinks that is illusionary.
Yeah, that is fine. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, maybe not. No, I think maybe not Adam. Actually, Adam might be in the.
I'm not sure. I think Dave also thinks that is irreducible.
We represent Edenic content by an irreducible property, but there is no object in the world which has.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I don't think he's so stupid to think. Yeah, well, I don't think anyone would be. No, I think even Adam wouldn't think there's actually an Edenic world somewhere out there. No, I don't think so. But I mean, I think it's actually reducible. Yeah.
Right.
I think even that part. Yeah. It's not just that you don't.
I mean, let's get back. So I want to follow up on this too, but I want to get too far away from where I was trying to stammeringly go about the perceptual reality monitoring. Because it seems, I mean, hearing you talk about this, it seems like there is a kind of misrepresentation you allow for, and maybe even radical misrepresentation. So what do you say about the hypothetical case where, let's suppose I have no red neurons, if I can speak that way, you were talking, the neurons would represent red. They aren't firing. But then I go into a higher order state that says that's veridical, and it gives the address of the red neurons. I experience red or no?
You experience red, yeah. So you
even without the first order content at all.
So you have the first order content. So you have the, well, yeah, your first order content. So I would say that you have the first order content. Your first order red neuron is always representing something. It's either representing internal generated firing or externally triggered firing, or it represents noise. So in that case, you mistaken first order noise as signal.
I see. So the neurons are always firing at their base rate or whatever.
Yeah, which they are.
And so you give the address of that. Yeah. But, you know, suppose that, so this kind of assumes a simple way of thinking about neuronal encoding, right? So what if there's a more complicated pattern of firing that has temporal dynamics to it? It's not just rates of firing or something like that. There's more, time locked synchrony, that kind of stuff that I like, or whatever. What if that's a part of it and it's not doing that? So you say.
Yeah, I agree.
Sorry, go ahead.
So on my view, all those dynamics are distal causes, but not constitutive components of the experience. So the dynamics would have an impact on the higher order discriminator, because ultimately the discriminator, has to use some properties of the vehicle to make that judgment about real or unreal. So the dynamics would be the normal causes. I shouldn't say just distal causes. They're the normal causes for whatever the discriminator says. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in that case, when you have the higher order state saying this is veridical, you experience red because you gave the address of where the red neurons live, but you don't have the red state down there. You don't have a first order state of seeing red. You don't have that.
You have some neurons. I mean, the neurons are there.
Well, you have neurons, but they're not representing red at that moment.
Yeah, they're not functionally, yeah, you're right. They're not functionally leading to downstream unconscious red detecting behavior. That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's basically a case of an empty higher order thought, right? I mean, you have the higher order state, but not the first order state.
Yes and no. Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, so I think, so there are two things. One is, yeah, so it's not that big of a deal. I'm happy to, we wrote the paper together. We think empty cases are plausible sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, but I thought it was your view that on the what we used to call joint determination, but which is now perceptual reality monitoring, that you don't get those kind of states. That was one of the advantages, was that you can rule out these kinds of truly empty ones. And in the old version of the view, in the case we're describing, I thought what you said is you experience something, but nothing determinate. You have a kind of radical kind of inflation going on there where you say, yeah, I see something and I'm very confident about it. But then when you go to say what it is, you fail or whatever. You can't
I gave you on earlier about the kind of mushy top-down address. So you can refer to a whole page instead of one line in a dictionary. So you can have refer to a whole category. So you can have something mushy. But I think I backtracked a little bit. I think it does have, to the extent that it refers to the vehicle, it refers to the position on the mental quality space. So you can represent it poorly, but it still has some locational information on the space. So it cannot be that weird.
Right. But now it just really brings up the issue again that it sounds like this is very similar to like a traditional higher order view, just implemented in a different way. So you still have something like I'm seeing red. It's just that instead of the linguistic or intentional content being like, I'm seeing red or something like that, it's done in neuronal terms, but it's ultimately you get the same stuff.
I think you're right. So first of all, there's no problem there. So if you get the same stuff, that's good enough for me. I never mean to say that I get more stuff. mostly I think
well, actually, I thought you did say that you could rule out these kind of radical misrepresentation cases.
Yeah, I think they are conceptually better. yeah, let me try. But my position is, has been changing, has been evolving a little bit. So I might be tiptoeing, backtracking a little bit. But let's say if it turns out it's the same stuff, it's not that bad for me. So that's okay.
Yeah, totally.
But let's try to run why I think there's some difference. I think the major difference to me is just explanatory. It's just how the way that you account for it, just make it sound more plausible, but it may be the same facts. So that's one. So I think that's most of the advantage of my view. It's not that it is substantively different. You just put it in terms that are more actual physiological and plausible. So I think so along that line, the advantage is when you say radical misrepresentation, the way that people think about it is you can have a first order that says red, and then you have a higher order that says something totally different. And I think that makes it sound not so attractive, makes the view sound not so attractive. I never thought this is such a big deal because it's the same in Ned's own view, right? You have phenomenality and access. So you have phenomenality and you get access as something totally different. You also have the similar kind of mismatch. It's just that the difference would be in one is at cognitive level, one is perceptual level. So it doesn't think
right.
So in my case, I think that you can refer to the address. If you fail to, let's say if you refer to some neurons that are not there, then nothing will be conscious. If you refer to some neurons that are conscious, then you say that these neurons, let's say they represent scarlet, and you say they are firing in reaction to an external object. Now, then you see some red, but your first order red neurons aren't actually firing. That's what you're saying.
Right.
That's fine. So you will have cases like that. I think the reason that they are kind of rare is in part because yes, I think I can find an answer to that too. It's because your higher order representation ultimately doesn't explicitly code anything, right? It just said that thing is legit. It's just what the discriminator does. And so all the impact, or the reason that we say that there is this mental quality space position is all due to some downstream impact on one's cognition. Yeah, I basically, so it kind of come back to the earlier question that I kind of dance around, don't answer. I don't think you really instantiate an experience per se. I think an experience is just a perceptual disposition to cause some cognitive impact. I think that's really all there is. When you say that you see red, the redness of red is just refers to a disposition for you to have a certain cognitive behavior. I don't think it's a thing. Yeah. So in that sense, it wouldn't be so bad because your higher order state would have a functional disposition to cause you to form beliefs that you are having a red experience, and that red experience would be like some other experience, etc. And then your first order state, if it's actual, would then also have the downstream functional implication to make you react. Like red means step on the brake pedal instead of the gas pedal. But if you lack that, then you just let the downstream cognitive thing resolve these conflicts. Yeah.
I mean, but it does sound like you should be more open to the idea that it's just the prefrontal cortex, which is determining the kind of experience that you're having, that you should be able to decode. Like if I'm having a crimson experience or a vermilion experience, that's decodable from the prefrontal cortex in the sense that it's giving these addresses, which is something that's got to be in the content, at least implicitly. So you should be able to get it fully from there, given what you're saying.
Hang on. You should be able to get it fully from there if the addressing system is kept constant. Yeah. In fact, if and only if. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, but I assume that it is in the adult human.
Well, it's constant. First of all, maybe not if and only if you can keep it constant, and also that if that addressing system is reasonably opaque. Yeah. So that is not so clear.
Right. That is not so. Yeah, I see.
Yeah. So you can have the same prefrontal neuron just by some slight change in synchrony and whatever properties that are not so easy to decode. That it refers to a different address. But if you can fully decode, you can fully work out which address is being pointed at, yeah, then of course. And then keeping the same address book, then you should be able to figure content. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I was misunderstanding or what hadn't appreciated this change in your view, because I thought that your view was that you shouldn't be able to do that. But
no, I think
even if you, I mean, I know the trumpet analogy and the piano analogy and all that, and prefrontal cortex, like the trumpet, you know, lots of different ways to sound the note, even with the same finger position, so that it may be hard to decode. Basically, I get that point. I like it. So, but even if you could fully understand the language of the prefrontal cortex, so to speak, I thought your view was that you may have to look to the first order states to see what experience was going on. But now it sounds like you backed up that that's not so much of a commitment.
No, it's not such a commitment. I think that's right. I think in fact I would be open to commit if you can fully work out the addressing system, and you keep the entire. If you understand the whole address system, and the address system is kept constant, then you'll be fine. Then you decode from PFC alone. Yeah, but I think this is highly non-trivial because well, I shouldn't say high from the PFC alone, from the higher order discrimination mechanism alone, and that itself, you know, it may be in the connections between the two, between the visual and the prefrontal cortex. So it's just not so trivial. Right.
I see. Yeah. Okay. So I see we're getting on, and I know I can't keep you forever, but I want to talk about the Frege-Schlick stuff and functionalism and inverts and all this stuff, because recently you've been on a anti-Mary functionalism crusade. I don't want to say crusade, but endeavor, let's say. So first, I wonder what do you think is why are you dissatisfied with like the traditional sorts of replies on behalf of functionalism? Why do you think we need to add another reply?
I'm not actually particularly dissatisfied. I just want to see how my view can provide replies. So that's more. So I don't necessarily want to say that those replies are no good. I just want to have some reply that will be consistent with my own view. And the other thing is, so when you say functionalism, do you mean those like long arm functionalists?
No, I mean your version of it.
Yeah, then it's fine. Then I think there are functionalist replies that will be fine. So that's helpful. I haven't fleshed it out so much in my draft of my paper. So there are two ways you can reply to these cases, right? One is to say, there's just no fact of the matter. Let's not talk about these, you know, comparing a normal person with a different person. And that is very useful. You can block a lot of those cases. So you can just say, the question is meaningless. You just refuse to give an answer. The other approach is to say, well, that person has functional differences, right? So the functional differences account for that. I'm actually trying to choose to do something in between, so that I don't really defend a real Frege-Schlick view. In the paper, I call it a commonsensical Frege-Schlick, which is exactly the two views that you make a contrast.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a bit of both, and because you're Frege-Schlick not because it's a kind of religious doctrine, not because you just say we can never talk about qualia across people. I don't think it was like that. I think the reason was just that because if qualia or experiences are relationally defined, then without knowing the relational basis, you just can't compare it across people.
Yeah, so can you say something, I mean, just generally about what the Frege-Schlick view is? Like, how do you interpret that view?
Yeah, the strong Frege-Schlick view, I think is kind of like almost a caricature that should make a set up in order to contrast it with common sense, right? So in common sense, of course, we can compare. If I ask you,
he didn't take it seriously until Stahlnocker's paper, basically, and then he was like, "Oh crap, yeah, that's actually something I should worry about."
Yeah, I think if you call it Frege-Schlick, just to kind of bracket and write it off as some crazy old idea from those logical positivists or whatever. But I think there's some truth to it, as Stahlnocker pointed out. If experiences are relational, if there's no red, if red is just redder, you see something as red because it's redder than everything else, then it depends on what those everything else is, right? It depends on what else you've seen. And I think that's what the common sense comes from, because in common sense, we just assume that the thing that you've seen in your life will be kind of like this thing that I've seen in my life. We assume that the relational basis, the calibration basis is pretty similar. you don't see things that differently. Then I can ask you, given that you see all these other things similarly, we've talked about how we see things, and we go to see shows and we see the same thing, and you talk about pictures, we have similar reactions. Then now I can ask you about those like internet, like blue and gold dress and stuff. Is how do you see it the same way? Then we can talk about it, because I assume you see red and green and black and blue the way I do. Then now with this controversial case, we can compare, right? And it's kind of similar to Bob Steiker used some analogy like utility is similar, right? So
yeah,
if I ask you whether you like whiskey as much as I like whiskey, well, I don't know. I used to not like Scotch so much. These days I like Scotch, so we both like Scotch more than bourbon. Does it mean I like Scotch just the same way you do? Well, that depends on so many things, and how, like, such as how much I drink, how much I like to spend money on drinks, how much I like food relative to drinking, and all this stuff. And if you assume all these stuff are similar between you and I, if we're pretty good friends, which we are, that we know our kind of behavior, then maybe we can talk about whether you like whiskey the same way I do.
Yeah, I passed your test when I was at your house, and you gave me the cheap stuff versus the good King George stuff, and I could tell the difference. And so I got the second drink.
Well, you mean the brandy?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So
like, I'm not going to give this to some.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's a good example. If you actually prefer those like cheap Applejack brandy over like nice cognac, then I would XOs, and I would then I'll probably think, well, the way you like Scotch is probably very different from the way I like it, right? So if you and I are so different, but you and I are kind of similar in our taste and other things, and so then we can talk about it. So it's the same way that if you talk about Mary, so that all depends on how Mary sees other things. If Mary really sees every single other color the same way we do, and she just happened to have not seen red, which is actually very inconceivable, because red is a fundamental color. If you've never seen red, probably other things will be very, very messed up. Then I would say that, yeah, then Mary probably knows what it's like to see red before she sees it, because I would tell her red is just like purple minus blue. And with some imagination, she would say, oh, I see. So that thing, that little tint of something that is different between purple and blue, that is red. And then you put.
But I mean, hold on, because you're getting too far down the road here for me. So, first of all, like, I find, so the fragrance view to me is like really bizarre. I find it's just incredibly strange to say that you can't talk about experiences across persons. So I understand what you're saying about, like, do you like something as much, but just the taste. Like, when I taste whiskey, do I have the same taste experience that you have when you taste whiskey? You think there's no fact of the matter answer to that question? I
think there is fact of the matter when everything else we've tasted in our lives are kind of similar. Yeah. I think if you have all your life, actually, that's a good example. You're a vegetarian. You've been a vegetarian pretty much your whole life. So there will be certain kind of food, I think there's really no fact of the matter. So let's say there's some sort of whiskey that people have put bacon fat to it. And then I think, like, do you think you taste that bacon fat infused whiskey the same as mine? I think in a way probably you do, because we like the same whiskey, we taste the same whiskey. But on the other hand, bacon fat probably tastes something pretty yucky to you. And
I mean, I've never had it. I don't know.
Yeah, you don't even know what it is like, so I don't know. I think that in a sense there is.
But I mean, I've had enough like pseudo bacon to sort of think that I know what bacon tastes like. Actually, I do think I sort of do know, even though I've never had it. I sort of know what it does taste like, because I've had a bunch of different versions of vegetarian bacons, and I can see what's common between all of them. In a sense, what they're trying to imitate, sort of, I can pick out, I think.
So that's exactly the kind of rationale of the commonsensical fragrance display. So in this case, since you just said that, then I would then as in a normal conversation, you say, oh, now then maybe you do know, right? So then maybe we can talk about it in a more meaningful way. So it all depends on how you can calibrate those relational bases, right? If you tell me,
but let me ask this in a different way. So do you not think there's an innate quality space? Is this like that we're like the old school empiricists used to say, you don't have to learn how to see red. You know, you kind of just get born, you open your eyes and there are red things out there.
I think there is some innateness. Yeah. I think the nature nurture debate mostly ended with a result that is kind of like 50-50, right? So I think there is some innateness, but it's not the issue though. It is though. I mean, if there's an innate quality space for like colors,
to some extent, then that the calibration question is already answered.
But that depends on how much innateness there is, right? Yeah.
Right.
And that doesn't have to be invariant across people. So our innate dispositions, given our genetic difference, might be slightly different. So it all depends on how much there is. So I'm not a strict figure slick in the sense that you can't. My point is you can, to the extent you can calibrate the relational base as well, and to assume that there's a common human factor that we both innately probably doesn't like bitter and presumably like sweet and stuff. Then yeah, we can assume that the calibration is reasonably good, and thereby you can compare. But when the calibration basis is really crazy, then there will be no factor.
Like between me and the computer program?
Well, the computer program had exactly the same experiences hooked up to some sensors and be able to do the same functional thing, then it's not that crazy. But if someone, generally thinks that, red is painful and blue is invisible and green is delicious or something like weird like that, then you sort of forget it. Like let's not talk. Like there's no fact of the matter.
Yeah, I guess I find that even in that bizarre case, I would say it's the red which is delicious, and red would still. I mean, it wouldn't taste the same to me.
In that
but
case,
it's
I'm
the
not
redness.
sure it's the same red anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I just really don't think. I mean, so another example is I'm slightly colorblind. I actually don't know whether my red is like anything like your red in that sense. I mean, it's probably something like your red. I'm not fully colorblind.
Yeah. I mean, so that's a good point, though. So doesn't like most vision science depends on there being these similarities? I mean, you bring someone into the lab and you do psychophysics and you say adjust these two spectrums until you see blue that's not greenish and not yellowish or whatever, and people adjust them and then they get blue, and people will sort of disagree on how much red, yellow and greenness goes into the mix. Like if you did it, you may put slightly more green in there and you say that's blue without being yellowish or greenish, and I may do it with slightly more yellow or whatever, but we both end up with something that we say looks to us like blue, which isn't greenish or yellowish. Yeah. And so we are comparing across each other.
That's right. That's
that's what you mean by the calibration.
Yeah. So because you and I do those psychophysics, we look very similar. So we empirically know that our cortex spaces are similar. So this is where the common sense and the commonsensical Frege-Schlick would dominate. But then why do I still want to hold on to the Frege-Schlick part? Is exactly also because this gives you a principle when you should go for the Frege-Schlick instead of common sense. When you talk about really crazy creatures, like in the Frege-Schlick came out recently in the literature, mostly from like Dave Chalmers talking about like Jeff Slee's, those really mind-bending cases of like a symmetrical person who never has any asymmetric experience in his life. In those cases, I feel it's just not worth talking about. Like,
right.
Those are not humans anymore, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, this is kind of like what Ned has said in various other places. Like those guys, their problems, they aren't our problems.
Yeah,
they have different problems. Okay.
Yeah,
but how does this get you out of invert? So, or zombies, or Mary. I don't see how once you allow the common sense stuff in, I don't see how you can still use this as a wedge against those kinds of anti-functionalist arguments.
Oh, I see. So, yeah, that isn't an extra wedge. I think the anti-functionalist arguments, the standard replies are fine in that case. Yeah. In the Mary case.
Okay, so I thought the whole point of the Frege-Schlick stuff was to like get rid of the anti-functionalist.
No, I think it's it is, but I think it's most useful in the weirder case, like Shoemaker paradox. So Shoemaker, so Bob Stoner could talk about the cases where someone will have two visual systems, you can switch back and forth and stuff like that. So those cases turn out to be very nasty to deal with, and I think the Frege-Schlick would be useful to say like, just forget it. That if you have two systems that can switch back and forth, that means that your psychophysics will be super weird anyway. And so I don't know what quality space you will be in, and then I can just write it off. But for like Mary, I think it would be slightly useful to use the Frege-Schlick. You can say if the lack of red experience changes the whole space, if it really changes everything, then it will be different. So you can answer it in parts. you can say, well, if it changes like that, then it'll be like this. If it doesn't change the space, well, then there will be some other answer. Yeah, you can,
okay.
you can partition the answer.
So generally, do you think that when Mary leaves the room, she learns something new, or do you not think that?
That's what I mean. Depends on how Mary is. So if Mary, despite her lack of ever seeing red, somehow learned the whole quality space very much like ours, and then I think there will be nothing new for her to learn, because when she sees red, she will say, "Oh, this is exactly what I always thought it would be, purple minus blue."
So what do you mean learn the whole quality space? Because I mean, we assume that Mary can know things like red is more similar to pink than it is to green. She can know those sorts of things. She can know even properties about the neurons firing and their statistical difference. She can know all that stuff.
Yeah,
but still seems like when she walked out of the room, she'd be like, "Oh, that's what the thing which is closer to pink looks like." It's like, that's what it is. It's red.
Yeah, but not in first person propositional, so not in first person vehicle terms. So she needs to know those vehicles. So she needs to know, okay, when she sees pink, she's know, okay, this is a vehicle. And when she sees purple, so this is a vehicle. By having the vehicle in her head, so prefrontal cortex needs to know that. So she needs to know that those I've experienced, purple and pink and orange, together somewhat the mix would give me red. It's not just propositionally. Of course she can know pink and all this stuff. Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I'm following. So when she walks out of the room, you're saying, so I guess there's two things that you might be saying, which I'm confused about. So on the one hand, there's the kind of move which I think David Rosenthal makes, which is that unless she has all these comparative phenomenal experiences, then her red is going to look very different. It's not going to look like red because she's not going to be able to say it's more similar to pink. She's never seen pink. She's not going to be able to say it's less similar to green. She's never seen green. So there's that point. I think that if the experiences really are relational in that way, then she needs a lot more experiences before she's going to have the kind of color experiences that we have. On the other hand, though, on the other hand, when she comes out and looks at the tomato or whatever, she may have the same experience that we normally would, I mean, as red perceivers, but she may, and she may know that that's more similar to pink because she's mastered conceptually these relations between one another.
Mm-hmm.
So which of those?
No, I think I do. I don't have a committed answer to this, but that's why I think the commonsensical figure slick is useful, is to allow you to say, when you describe the second case, you already have to assume whether her red experience would be like our red experience. So you're making a cross-people comparison there. Yeah. And I'm saying you can do that only if she has a very similar space to ours. Right?
But why wouldn't she?
Well, because she's never seen red herself. So her blue is never bluer than red.
Well, she's never seen any colors before, right, in the traditional experiment.
She had never seen any color.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only black and white.
Oh, sorry. I thought that she's she's never seen any of those colors, and she would basically have no space. Yeah, she doesn't have the first order space. Yeah, she has.
Yeah, so that's kind of the Rosenthal move there.
Yeah, then I would say that. Yeah, I somehow I'm mistaken. There's another version that she just never saw red, but she saw some other colors.
Yeah, no, in the traditional version, she's never seen any color, only black and white. But why? So that was my kind of innateness point. If the space is innate, it's just never been activated. It's there, it's just never been activated.
Oh, I see. You're not. No, but that's an empirical question. Again, so the figure slick is useful because I don't want to. Because I think there's so much empirical assumptions here, it's hard to know for sure which one is true. They're not compatible. So the figure slick will tell you, to the extent that she has a space, let's say through innate or hardwire or whatever. In that case, and if she has only seen black and white, then I think she would not know she would be surprised what red is like. Yeah, she would learn something because she has never learned that red. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about it, but I've been thinking about the wrong version of the story. So she would learn that red would be different from those other colors. I think she would never have the first. I would say she would never have the first person grasp the space. Yeah.
Right. So she would know conceptually that red is like more like pink.
Yeah.
But she would experience red for the first time and then go, oh, right, that's the thing which is closer to pink. That's what it's like to see red. To me, that's what she learns. When she walks out of the room, she learns what it's like to see red, which she didn't know before.
Yeah, sorry.
But the Frege Schlick isn't helping you here. Because to get the Frege Schlick view, you have to say, there's just no fact of the matter about. But even if you, now I'm thinking about it, even if you agree with the Frege Schlick view, you still doesn't answer the puzzle, because you still need to appeal to one of the traditional answers, because even if what she experiences is very different from our experience, she still experiences something which she couldn't know about in the room.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think a couple of things here. I don't think the Frege Schlick was particularly useful for Mary. I think the Frege Schlick is most useful for those Simon, that is the Jeff Lee case, those like weird individuals, and Shoemaker paradox, those people can switch their visual systems. It might be useful for some cases of inverted spectrum where they have hypothetically, actually it's quite useful for inverted spectrum. Yes, most people when it comes to people who got surgical rewired cases, Frege Schlick is useful to block out those weird cases.
But it doesn't block out a kind of inverted lenses version of this, right? So if you put on inverting lenses, so that the grass, which is green, the wavelength of light gets inverted by the glasses you're wearing, so that what you end up constantly experiencing is red.
That's right. Yeah.
You can still compare across persons in that case. There's nothing that would rule that out.
That's right. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So that's why I don't want to commit to a strict Frege Schlick. So it's only basically it does what it does. The commonsensical Frege Schlick rule out cases where the people have very different spaces.
Yeah, but that's not really the heart of the anti-functionalist arguments, is it?
Well, it depends on where you see the heart is, but yeah, but having that doesn't hurt you either. Especially if you take the
Well, it just seems
commonsensical.
too weird. I don't know. It's such a cost. The Frege Schlick view has such a cost.
No, what the commonsensical Frege Schlick view is not. It's basically cost free. The commonsensical.
Yeah, I guess once you add the common sense stuff in, I see what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why. So yeah, of course, if you go to the hard Frege Schlick, I think I'm with you. The costs far outweigh the benefits. You can rule out those few cases, and then you can't even talk about the blue and glow dress anymore, and that's not worth it. But I think commonsensical Frege Schlick is basically cost free.
So I wonder what you think about the more absent qualia versions of arguments against functionalism. What about Ned's? I don't know why they always pick on China, but his Chinese nation thought experiment, where you have all the people duplicating the functionality of your brain for an hour. I know why he picked that, because a lot of people there, a lot of neurons, whatever. Okay, so suppose you have 86 billion people all imitating sending coordinated by satellites. He has the whole thing. Does that thing experience, on your view?
I think it will not, but for a trivial reason, it's not fast enough to really do the program. But imagine if it's some other example you have, like little Martians or whatever, that they're very efficient and doing. I only saw Daniel Stojar quoting him saying that. I don't know where does that come from. Maybe minus software brain or something. There's some example that he gave. So let's say the highly efficient Martian population that try to simulate our brain for once, and I think we'll be conscious. Why does
the speed matter?
Well, because
if we slowed your brain down to 1/8 of its speed, you wouldn't be conscious anymore.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, it's like computers. So some computers cannot run some programs, right? So you take your old computer, sometimes you just can't run the program. I don't exactly know. That depends a bit of serious considerations, hardware, software engineering there. But assume that to the extent that you can really run something. Yeah.
So in principle, then you could have a conscious nation running a program in this way. I don't really see why it matters the speed of it. So if it's very slow, then I mean, you wouldn't notice a difference if things were happening very slowly. That if we slowed everything down to 1/8 of the time that they're occurring right now, you wouldn't notice a difference.
No, I don't mean, sorry, I think a slower computer doesn't just run the program slower. So if you have you would take like a 1990s PC and try to run Windows or run whatever Mac OS on it, it's not just it doesn't run, it crashes. It doesn't run slower, it crashes.
Yeah, but
So
that's because of other
crash.
factors like the RAM and.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't think it just means speed. You have to, somehow is it powerful enough to run the program. I agree with you. Even if it runs very slowly, it would just be very slow consciousness. It will be conscious.
Yeah, and you wouldn't notice it though either, right?
Because you're not the country. I mean,
there's this really great set of, Permutation City. Do you know this? It's a story by, I think it's Greg Egan, Andy Egan. It's one of the Egans. But anyway, it's these AI creatures in this virtual computer simulated world, and they're doing all these things like running it very slow. They're running it backwards. And basically his basic idea is that he's like a computer scientist who writes novels. And I really like his stuff. But anyway, so his basic idea is you couldn't tell the difference whether things they would all seem the same to you. All the same states would be preceded by the same states, et cetera. And there's no way to phenomenologically distinguish these cases.
Yeah, I agree. Slow consciousness is consciousness. Yeah. And it may not really matter either if everything is slowed down. Yeah, I would think so. I would bite the bullet and think so. Yeah, and say so.
Okay,
but it's not a big deal. I don't find it such a big deal.
No, it's not a big deal. I mean, the net originally came up with this stuff to try to argue that the substrate is important. You're right. That's something that would be weird about consciousness being instantiated by a bunch of people sending signals between each other, as opposed to like a brain doing it.
Our brains, but the substrate is our brain is instantiated by a bunch of neurons. It's just as strange. When we go to the substrate, actually unpack it, it's just as weird. Like everything's weird.
Everything is weird. Yeah.
If you have to actually, I think this is what I think is maybe we're about to have to wrap up. But I think I don't mind chatting for longer. But I think usually you don't go beyond 2 hours.
Well, it's the nap time of the kids which dictate my availability.
Kind of crazy. but I think it's weird either way. But in some ways, if you think about it, functionalism is a lot less weird because at least you can now look at the program and see what it does. There's some sort of understanding you can achieve. If it's a brute physical matter that has no function, in biology, that is like looking for a non-mechanistic explanation, and that is truly magical. So in biology, we look for substrates that actually mechanistically explain the functions or whatever phenomenon we want. But basically, who's weird? I think both are weird, but I think they are much weirder. They want to look for a substrate that does not provide a mechanistic explanation. I think that, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not so weird if you think consciousness isn't mechanistic. So I mean, that was kind of the idea in the background, is that conscious experience is sort of extra functional. That it's not exhausted by functional capacities or informational processing capacity, et cetera. If that's your view, which I think is Ned's view, then it's better to think that it's a property of the substrate than to think that it's an irreducible non-physical property or a property of neurons or something like that.
Yeah, I understand that. And I understand that it's not just that, well, first of all, in that literature, certainly he has gone very far and made a lot of impact. But I'm just saying, like, if you fit it back to the broader picture of biology in general, this will stick out. So yeah. So it's weird either way. Yeah, I would think I'd rather be not weird to my biologist friends than to be not weird to my philosopher friends. I think.
Well, functionalism is a dominant view in philosophy too. I mean, don't get whatever that survey that Chalmers did. It's like it's off the charts in favor of functionalism. Of course, Ned would think I'm weird.
That's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I'm like I said, I think in philosophy, the thing I'm pretty wishy-washy in my commitments because I'm like, I'm just a kid from LA. I don't know what the hell's going on around here. I like arguments and thinking about stuff, but it's hard for me to commit to something. But my strongest commitment is to the identity theory that the brain and the mind are identical to each other. That's the thing that I've believed for the longest, and that I find the most forceful in my thinking about this stuff. And that would be a kind of biopsychism view, right? Because that if what the mind is just the brain, then it's not something functional. It's something that biological. But I mean, I'm not. Yeah.
But that's also compatible with functionalism.
It's not.
In the way that you just put it, yeah. If it's just the mind is the brain, but maybe the mind is the brain in virtue of the fact that the brain is implementing some function.
Yeah, then it's not the brain. So like think about gold. If gold is identical to a certain atomic structure, then duplicating the properties of gold, but without that atomic structure, you don't have gold. So if the mind is identical to the brain, then it's identical to the brain in the way that gold is identical to a certain atomic structure.
Yeah,
if you don't have the atomic structure, you don't have the mind. I mean the brain. Excuse me, the gold. Sorry, shit.
No,
so if you like on my way of thinking, if you did the computer program thing, I don't think it would be. I hope it wouldn't be conscious. I mean, that would. But
I thought that
ruin my.
You said I thought that you also include the kind of anomalous monism.
Well, what do you mean?
Like Davidson. So there just has to be some substrates identical to some experience, but it's not the kind of substrate is always identical to this kind of experience, right? Do you think that the type matching has to be coherent or systematic?
Yeah. So I mean, anomalous monism is something that I'm not like super against, but I don't really see any reason to accept it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fine. Yeah. I think that's kind of. No, I was thinking about anomalous monism, about Davidson, like Donald Davidson. I think at some point, I think it's Donald Davidson has a point about. So even if it's identity, it can be an identity in a way that is not the type. The type matching can be completely crazy. So it just that some experience always have some physical substrate, and I think that. I always took it that would be compatible with functionalism too, right? Because you can implement so your software.
Well, that's just physicalism. I mean, physicalism is the view that every experience has some physical substrate, but identity theory is that the substrate matters for the kind of thing that it is. So that seeing red, if it's a bunch, the way identity theorists think about it, if seeing red is the activity of neurons in V4. Then if you don't have those things acting in that way, you don't get conscious experience of red at all.
Yeah, then you're right. Then we are directly in contrast.
Yeah, I mean, functionalism is the thing I like the least in philosophy. I think it's the most. I think it's even stranger than. I'd rather be a panpsychist than a functionalist, to be honest with you. I think functionalism is bizarre. But I mean, who am I? Like I said, I don't know. But
I think it's not about who. I think it's fair to say. I mean, there's no hostility between these views, right? I mean, we all know that these are all weird, but I think my point is just that I'm a pragmatist, not just in the philosophical sense, but also as a person and as a scientist. You want to do science, you have to make progress. So I think trying to convince the scientific community at large, or biology, or neuroscience, or cognitive neuroscience, whichever group you want to convince them that panpsychism is true and functionalism is wrong, you would have a very hard time. Yeah. There's a
I don't know. It worked on Koch.
Huh?
On Christoph.
look how well he's done. let's put it this way, and then say no more. Yeah, look how well he's done to his own legacy.
Yeah, I mean just on a personal note, that's something I've always found like strange, is that if you're willing to endorse something like panpsychism, then why not just identity? I don't understand. So if you're so willing to endorse something strange, I mean,
I think they are identity theorists, right?
Well, they're not brain-mind identity theorists. They're
not brain-mind. Yeah, it has to be.
Yeah. So, but you're right. Philip does put it in terms of like the consciousness identical. Electrons are identical with the consciousness, which so there is an identity there. But even functionalists are identity theorists in that broad sense, because they say conscious experience identical with a certain functional profile.
So you're really biopsychist.
I don't think I'm really anything, but the thing which I think that I'm most strongly committed to is, that there's something biological which is distinctively important for
Very good company. You have Ned on your side too, so.
Yeah,
Those are not
I like that part of Ned. I definitely like that part of Ned. I mean, I try to combine it with like, I think it's still higher order theory could be true, because I think, well, if you have a higher order thought, what a thought may be is something biological, so that it may not be duplicatable in a silicon substrate, in which case, it's compatible with even that sort of view. I know that David is a functionalist, like, so Rosenthal, I mean. So he thinks thoughts are functional properties, but we don't know that for sure, and it's not clear what a thought is at this point in time. Ultimately, what I think is that, well, we'll have to see how it pans out. Certainly, if I'm pragmatist enough, I'm not really a pragmatist, I'm pragmatist enough to say that if you could build something that acted like me and said, what is this thing called life? I know I'm a computer program, but I feel like I'm so much more. Like if they started saying shit like that to me, I'd be like, yeah, welcome to the club. You're conscious. But the hope is that that's not going to happen. And every time we've tried, we've hit roadblocks. So look at the Blue Brain project. It wasn't exactly as successful as people thought. And modeling these things actually is really a lot harder. The details are a lot trickier. And we just still don't have this better than I do. We still don't really know what the brain is doing or how it's doing it. So I think all these questions are open, but they're ultimately, that part of it, I think, is the empirical content of the question.
Yeah, that's totally right. That's totally right. So I think so in that sense, I always feel it may be too early to worry about these problems. I mean, we haven't even gone that far in writing down the functional recipe, like what we talked about when we started, and maybe just crash and burns. Then there's no need to get too hung up about functionalism. It might just be empirically,
exactly.
It just dies, then you don't have to worry about that. And if it doesn't die, well, then our intuition probably will change in time.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially, you can see when I write out my functional recipe, I end up invoking those terms like vehicle properties and stuff. And as soon as I do that, I think people like Ned might be slowly warming up to the ideas too. I don't know.
Gradually winning them over. I mean, I've heard Ned say strange things, like he thinks, he gave that talk at Google, and I heard it.
Analog.
Analog, exactly. So it may be
just analog machine.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that already gives a lot of ground, I would say.
I think when Ned stopped attacking functionalists, so should the rest of you.
Hey, I never attacked functionalism. The only thing I've ever written about this is my Shambi paper, where I just say, a priori arguments against physicalism need to be put on the back burner, what I call deprioritizing in homage to the marijuana laws. I don't think a priori arguments are bad. I just think they need to be deprioritized. We have more important things to worry about at this moment, like getting the data and getting a theory. And then we can revisit all this stuff about that stuff. But I just think the people who, what I'm mostly against is like, people who think the mind is non-physical and that they think that because of a priori reasons, I think, are jumping the gun. Like people, like I would include Chalmers but also people like Philip and, Bernardo Castro. A lot of these people who just, their intuitions they take them way too seriously that, consciousness can't be explained physically. And I don't know. Maybe it can. Certainly, I think it's conceivable that physicalism is true, or that there be physical creatures like us that have consciousness. So I think the arguments there come to a stalemate.
I think in that sense, you and I are very similar on this. Like, let's just get some work done and see kind of attitude. So maybe I should tone down. I shouldn't say I'm a functionalist. I'm just a functioning functionalist. I just function as if I'm a functionalist. I don't commit to the view so seriously either. Like, I'm a scientist. I need to get something done.
This is really that's why I started off this conversation asking about what your view about philosophy and science, sort of how they put together, because at the macro level, there's nothing that distinguishes functionalism from biopsychism. The brain's job is to move us around. Functionalists believe that. Identity theorists believe that. There's no like thing which we can do, which the other side's going to say, no, we don't do that. So they're empirically equivalent at this point in time. They say the same thing. The only place they differ are in these hypothetical counterfactual situations about conscious computers, or I mean, this is something like the multiple realizability argument, which I used to go on and on about. It's like people say, oh, well, you could realize the pain state in lots of different ways. Yeah, but we haven't proven that. There's no evidence for that. As far as we know, it's the same kind of activity in the same places. So, I mean, all of these things, which are anti-functionalist and anti-biopsychism, they all involve these hypothetical counterfactuals as opposed to actual empirical evidence. And so let's get the empirical evidence and then see what our intuitions are.
I think there is one thing that could distinguish it. So besides so that basically, this is very helpful. I haven't thought about it this way. But one is to write out the functional recipe and try to see how we can run with it and implement it different ways and see whether you get the same result. That's one way. And the other way would be once you actually get to the bottom, you identify the physical substrate. Then I think the biologists and the neuroscientists would try to see, well, so what are the mechanisms given these things? And at some point, if likewise, it's very similar to the other argument. If at some point there's just no mechanism they can understand anymore, it's just like, this is the thing. I don't know what it does, but somehow if you break it, it doesn't. Like the case of gold. Like if you just like, okay, this is the structure, but if I replace the molecule here, then the thing doesn't become gold. And I think if that happens, then if you can get this consistent enough to convince the rest of the scientific community, then I think the functionalists would vote too.
Yeah, but we're a long way from that. I mean,
years.
yeah, exactly. We're looking for our keys under a certain street light, and we're not even sure if that's where the answer is.
At this rate, if the panpsychists have more, airtime, I think we'll never get there. Forget it. Like the business will probably just die out.
Do you really think that? I mean, this takes us full circle back to the beginning, but so your basic idea is that if they keep making a lot of noise, then consciousness science will just become disreputable even more than it already is.
Yeah, I think right now it's still considered within the realm of noise. Yeah, I mean, at some point, but it's not, I mean, it's threatening. I must say, I think that people don't, very few people see it the way I do. Let me put it this way. I know I'm the minority here, worrying about things that people aren't really worrying about yet. But I think the reality is our placement and funding records are not good. We are not really very much respected within the mainstream, if at all. And so the noise is still small, but it's growing and it's becoming more and more prominent. I mean, just look at last year, you mentioned Christoph and Philip, Annika Harris wrote a book also, panpsychism, and I think that's a problem because I think she's a very good writer, and what do you expect? She just go and look at who are the experts in the field, and then turns out a good number of them are panpsychists. So she would truthfully amplify that voice and write a popular book that said, well, so it's now actually becoming. There's an illusion that it is really panpsychism is really becoming very dominant, and I think that's bad because it's an illusion. Right? Among the scientists, we don't think that at all, but I think people do try to fudge the boundary sometimes. I'm not sure in an entirely honest way, and try to say, well, more and more scientists are taking this seriously. In fact, it's no, very few of them. Most of us think it's actually terrible, but this is working the business.
I mean, in the history of science, though, there were a lot of panpsychists. I mean, some of the most famous scientists from the 19th century were panpsychists.
Yeah, all that's fine. But they've never seen deep mind beating, humans on chess and all this stuff. They've never seen how much software can do.
Right.
Just different times. You can't do that. I mean, I think they people. But when I used to go to church in my teenager years, they also do this stuff and say, oh, and famous scientists believed in God, and so should you. Well, maybe that kind of arguments aren't so good. I mean, there are other reasons you should believe in God, but don't quote me these historical figures. And they live in different times, right?
But so, I mean, I know maybe we've already answered this, but let me just double check again, because suppose that, your way of doing things pans out roughly, and we get to the bottom of everything. We look for mechanisms and we find mechanisms. Then we implement them in a computer program and we get it saying things like, what is this thing I see red? Oh, what is it like for me? And how do you explain it? The computer program says things like us. So then you would take that as evidence that the program is conscious, right? But so would the panpsychist. The panpsychist would say the computer is conscious, you guys are going to disagree philosophically about what the basis of the consciousness is. You're going to say all you need is the program. They're going to say the program is connected to these, fundamental qualities in a certain way or something like that. So at that point, is it just sociology that wins, or like what do you do at that point?
Well, no. I think first of all, the evidence isn't mostly based on the computer simulation. So as I said, like the evidence really comes from the human cases first, right? And then you do the induction, and you generalize it to other animals, and you generalize it ultimately to the computer. So the computer case is actually pretty weak as an evidence, right? I mean,
no, I don't mean that it's evidence. I just mean what I'm saying though is that you and the panpsychists are going to agree that the computer program is conscious.
Yeah, depends on the kind of panpsychist views. Yeah, I think so. I think just on that case, then there's not much difference, except that the panpsychist would have other problems. Yeah, I think the panpsychists don't. Yeah, I think you're right. So when it comes to panpsychists who try to interpret human functional consciousness, will be the same. I think the problem with panpsychism is not there. The problem with panpsychism is about the little things that don't function at all, and they say that it's conscious. And I think those are really the bane of panpsychism.
What do you mean, like electrons?
Yeah. It just rendered the term consciousness kind of meaningless to most people.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see that. So, I mean, their notion of consciousness is that there's something that it's like. So they're saying there's something that it's like to be an electron. We know what that means from our own case, that there's something that it's like to be us. What it's like to be the electrons is much simpler, but they're ultimately, I mean, so.
I think our difference comes down to this. I think that if you don't think you're conscious, you are not conscious. If you I want to qualify. We repeated that. I mean, if you think you're sometimes conscious, but in some other time you don't think you're conscious, you're basically not conscious for all practical purposes. So I think that's our difference. You don't think so, right? You think our thinking about it is just our thinking about it. Even if you don't think it, you are. So if I now tell you that actually you can sense magnetic forces, I can now find some neurons in the brain that actually can respond to magnetic forces and directions and stuff. So you have to first order correlate. So you're actually conscious. And say, well, no, but I never feel them. I said, well, you don't think you felt them, but you have.
Right.
So use the force is in you. But you don't think so. And then I think that's that, right?
So that's your case against electrons. They don't think they're conscious.
No, I don't think it's my case against electrons is the following. Is that because of again, it comes from a human case. If I'm unconscious of some representation, let's say I'm doing binocular rivalry and I'm seeing one picture but not the other picture leads to some firing in my brain. The panpsychists say those neurons will still be conscious. It's just that I'm not conscious of that picture, but those neurons, they are things, right? At least some panpsychists would say they're conscious. So they're just not combined in my subjecthood. I find that is just,
but that's, I mean, Ned says that, and he's not a panpsychist. I mean, that's just overflow. Lots of people can accept that. But panpsychists could also deny that. I mean, someone could say—
depends on how you do the combination.
Yeah, exactly. It depends on how you do the combination. So that's why they, people like Philip, he's like, oh, he's all for neuroscience, trying to find out what brain states correlate with what we call conscious experience. And then he just thinks that to explain that, you have to appeal to these fundamental things, which are irreducible and, not physical in the traditional sense. So
I don't want to attack panpsychism any further because I feel it will sociologically die out in the end to the extent they don't pull more foul play moves. So I don't feel that need to philosophically handle it. But I think you pulled a fast one on me. I don't think Ned would say that. I think when under binocular rivalry, the suppressed image, I don't think Ned would say that those neurons are conscious.
He does.
I think if you No. I think if you cognitively, so they're different. So there are some neurons that in which the subject cannot cognitively access, and he would say that they're phenomenally conscious. But I don't think Ned would say that every neuron is always phenomenally conscious.
No, he doesn't say that. No.
Exactly. But panpsychists, some form of panpsychists would say that, right? Even electrons are conscious. So all the electrons in your head, the neurons have electrons in them. right? Because the neurons have protons and all this stuff, and all of those will be conscious. So then in some sense, those electrons never cease to be conscious, even when you are not conscious of what they're representing.
Well, actually, that's not his view. His view is that the parts are conscious, but the neuron is not conscious.
Whose view? I'm talking about some panpsychists, not a specific one. But
Well, that's Philip's view, I know. For
yeah, okay. Philip's view changes. I try to engage with him. I don't think I can get a
I think that's
consistent.
Chalmers' view. I mean, all the panpsychists I know, that's their claim. No current modern panpsychist claims that like pencils are conscious or neurons are conscious.
I think you're right about that.
I mean,
well,
just for the record, I'm not a
look
fan of panpsychism. Like I said,
Yeah.
I have no credence.
Yeah,
in it,
I'm also not an enemy of it at the philosophical level. I don't engage at that level. But no, I'm not sure actually. I think that depends on how you deal with the combination problem. But I don't. I think I have never gotten a coherent view from any of these guys, I would say, but I also don't study it very deeply. But I think at least they would say the pencil contains parts that are conscious.
Yeah, they do say that.
Yeah. And I think that's weird enough. And likewise, your neurons would your neurons would always either be part of some consciousness or it would contain some parts that are conscious.
Yeah.
And I think that's weird. That's weird enough. Like every single one of your neurons, regardless of what you're seeing, regardless of how your consciousness changes, every single neuron either would be part of your consciousness or they would be conscious or they would contain some parts that's conscious. I think Ned would ever say that. He
wouldn't say that. You're right. Yeah. No, that's definitely the case. All right. Well, I'm hearing stirrings of young pitter patters downstairs. So before we go, though, I wonder if there's anything that you were hoping would come up, but which didn't come up. And the answer can be no, but I just want to know.
No, not really. I think that's pretty good. That's pretty useful. Yeah. Cool.
Okay. Well, thank you, Hakwan, for this really rich and enjoyable discussion. I had a great time, and I appreciate you spending this time with me.
No,
hang out for a second.
I find it more useful than I probably, I'm writing a paper, so this is kind of like a tutorial getting. It's very useful for me.
Yeah.